Hello, welcome to Cashcraft TV. My name is Kaelan Ashcroft. Thanks for watching another video on ancient Greek and Roman history. Today we will be doing Dion from ancient Syracuse and Marcus Brutus from ancient Rome. So Plutarch opens up this section with a quote from Senecio, and he basically says that Troy owed nothing to the Corinths. And this is relevant in terms of the Iliad, Homer's ancient novel on the fall of Troy at the hands of Greece. So basically what he means by this is that the Corinthians supported both sides of the war. They supported the Greeks because they were Greek, but they also helped out the Trojans in their war. So he draws this as a parallel to in that Plato owed nothing to either the Romans or the Greeks. In that, as these two as an example, Dion was directly a student of Plato, and Marcus Brutus largely drew his philosophical compass from Platonic beliefs, and he was very much a student of the ancient academy through which Plato was a member of and founder of. So, yeah, I guess we'll start off with Dion. So, at the time Dion was alive or was born, Dionysius I was a tyrant in Syracuse, the main city in Sicily, the island of Sicily. So Dionysius, Plato uses as an example of pretty much the epitome of a tyrant. He was very cruel. To use as an example, his first time reigning supreme over the land, he had this wife, and he was so abusive that she killed herself. And then temporarily he falls out of power, but then once again he reigns supreme again, and he takes two wives simultaneously. And pretty much no one in the land really knew which one he married first, because supposedly they were married at the same day. Whenever he went to meals, he would bring both wives at the same time, and he would sort of just, in terms of sharing his bed, just rotate between the two. So it was kind of tough to determine who would be heir to his throne or to his tyrannical government. But one of the two was actually, her name was Doris, and she was foreign born, and the other, Aristomach, was actually Sicilian born, so she was more in favor amongst the people. However, Aristomach could not produce any male children, and Dionysius was super upset with this. He even went so far as to kill Aristomach's mother, accusing her of giving drugs to Aristomach to make her not produce any sons. However, his other wife, Doris, who was foreign born, actually managed to produce sons, most notably Dionysius II, who ultimately ends up becoming his heir. But despite this, Aristomach's brother was Dion, so that he's the main topic of this live. So he, despite not actually sharing any blood with Dionysius, really wins his favor, especially particularly at a young age. And Dionysius actually hires Plato to come and teach him, and originally he invited him to Sicily, and he says, well, by the gods, it appears that you have found such a virtuous one, and that is Dion. So Dion is sort of selected to be Plato's student, and which is very sort of almost ironic, because Plato's beliefs were almost completely contradictory to Dionysius's tyrannical government. And throughout Dion's tutelage under Plato, he on many occasions tries to convince Plato to sort of change Dionysius's ways and sort of stop the tyranny. I think it's pretty important to note, and Plutarch credits him with this too. Dion had every reason to believe in tyrannical beliefs and believe in luxury and to believe in opulent spending because of his own relation with Dionysius and his own upbringing, but it said that his relationship with Plato sparked a flame in him, and he really, and I think what Plutarch is hinting to is that Dion actually had a certain great virtue or great goodness of character that was just sort of unleashed by his relationship with Plato. But nonetheless, at one point, Plato actually gets in a lot of trouble with Dionysius. He openly criticizes tyrants by saying that tyrants should, of all people, be the most content with their place and not be tyrannical, because if they are tyrannical, it's sort of, as Plato points out, sort of like an insecurity. If you truly do have power over your people, you don't need to be so forceful or so authoritative. So, and this really upsets Dionysius. So he actually, when Plato is leaving the place, he tells one of the men on the boat to try to assassinate him or to make him a slave. Fortunately for Plato, he is made a slave when they land in Athens. So he's a slave in Athens, but it doesn't really affect Plato too much because Plato's was obviously too intelligent to become a slave, and his slave owners sort of recognized this and sort of let him keep sort of doing his own thing. But despite this, and despite Dion trying to spark change in Dionysius, their relationship actually maintains pretty strong. So Dion is actually granted full control or full usage of Dionysius's treasury. Obviously, he had to ask permission to use anything, but he pretty much was like CFO of the state. So very powerful position, especially considering they didn't share much blood. So obviously, I think Dionysius must have really liked his sister Aristomache, because she was foreign born and he took her as a wife anyways, and he really liked Dion and sort of brought him up. So Dion gets his first sort of government role as being an ambassador to Carthage. So Carthage at this time was somewhat of an ally, and he obviously does very well over there and wins a lot of their respect. But he is pretty much, despite Dionysius being tyrannical and many of the people in the state hating him, Dion is the only one who really has the guts to speak up to him. At one point, Dionysius is publicly shaming this individual named Gelon, and Dion stands up and says that, Dionysius says that Gelon is such a bad leader, and he was a Carthaginian leader. But Dion points out that at least for Gelon, his poorness justified Dionysius's reign, whereas Dionysius's poorness disjustified his reign. So he's saying that Dionysius is just as bad, he just happens to be on the other side of the coin. So this obviously upsets Dionysius, but despite this, it never really creates a huge rift between the two. He also ends up marrying his one of his nieces, one of the daughters of Doris. So they do sort of get a blood connection there. Eventually, he returns back from Carthage after being an ambassador, and Dionysius is on his deathbed. And Dion tries to convince Dionysius to make him heir to the throne and his bloodline, along with Aristomache, his sister. But supposedly the physicians poisoned Dionysius early, so nothing could materialize here. And as a result, Dionysius the second, son of Doris, ends up becoming the essentially king or tyrant of the land. So Dionysius II at this point was very, we'll just refer to him as Dionysius here so it's not as confusing, but from now on, if I'm referring to, unless otherwise specified, if I say Dionysius, it's Dionysius II, because that's the majority of the rest of this life. So Dionysius was really young at this point and really naive. Dionysius I had really sheltered him. He kept him in the Acropolis for much of his life because he was worried that one of his only heirs would be killed or whatnot. So he was very sheltered. He was not learned. He was not very tough. And he, in terms of establishing his government, he hires, I think, a bunch of his friends who were also very young too. So they were not very powerful. So Dion was a lot older at this point. Well, older relative to Dionysius. So he pretty much ran the government at this point. He and Dionysius got along actually pretty well because they both were essentially family. They were essentially, in some ways, like brothers, or at least uncle and nephew. And he suggests to Dion, because Carthage is no longer much of an ally with Sicily or Syracuse. So he suggests that he goes and makes a peace treaty, or he be allowed to arrange a army to go and fight them. And Dionysius actually supports this, and he respects Dion. He knows he's a very learned individual, but all of his allies sort of fear that Dion has the intention of taking control of the state, and probably rightfully so, but I think they would just fear his ambition. But I think he could have, and he does prove to be a better leader anyway. So we'll get to more to that later. So Dion actually calls Plato again to try to train Dionysius, and Dionysius is actually pretty open to this because he's still very young and very malleable, or very impressionable. So he actually enjoys the teaching of Plato. But very quickly, Philistas returns, who is another teacher and a very powerful person in Sicily, and pretty much all of his advisors and all of his supporters want to get rid of Plato and want Dionysius to have all the power, because they fear that Dion will take the power, which is very contradictory to what ultimately happens. So eventually, so Dion, because he knows that there might be a war with Carthage pretty soon, is exchanging letters, because he had a good relationship with them because his prior employment as an ambassador. So he actually sends a letter to them saying that he'll grant them all of their wishes. But Dionysius actually intercepts the letter, and they go on a walk, like over on the beach, and he it starts off as a friendly walk, but then he reveals to Dion that he had read the letter and that he felt that Dion had betrayed him. So he is actually exiled off to Athens, so he's banished from the land. But actually Dionysius was still very partial to Dion at this point, so he actually allowed his family to send him 2 ships of supplies every once in a while, and he was also allowed to keep all of his land and still draw rental income from it. So he was not too harsh. He just kind of wanted to remove him from the land so that he couldn't take his power or cause any sort of uprising. Strangely enough, Plato stayed. I don't think this is because he was partial to Dionysius and his coming tyrannical ways, but I think he foreshadowed or foresaw some problems happening, and he thought that he could help. But either way, Dion actually has a pretty good, it's almost like a midlife retirement for him. He studies a lot, and he studies at the Athenian Academy some more. He lives a pretty leisurely life. He gets a nice house there. He involves himself in the Eleusinian Mysteries, which is like a big religious festival. Sparta, and he's actually quite a celebrity in mainland Greece. Sparta actually grants him citizenship, despite them being at war with Thebes, who was an ally of Sicily. So he does quite well over there, and he sort of, if things did not change and go sour back in his homeland, he probably would have lived there until retirement as an intellectual. But if that were to happen, probably he would not be included in these lives anyway. So for better or for worse, he ends up getting called back. So Dionysius, for some reason, and it's not really explicit why, he starts to get really tyrannical, and I think maybe it's just because he shares blood with Dionysius the First, just a tyrannical gene. Maybe he wanted to follow in his own footsteps. But either way, he imprisons Plato, and he seizes all of Dion's property while abroad. Maybe he was just jealous of his fame abroad, or maybe things were not going well for him, but he seizes all of his property, and he even takes Dion's wife, who is actually one of his sisters, and forces her to marry a different individual, one of his generals. So obviously this is something that would have upset Dion, who was abroad at the time. But Dion is fortunately informed that if he were to return to Sicily, he would not even need to generate an army, because he had so much popular support in Sicily. So I suppose what was happening was, not only was Dionysius going sort of berserk towards Dion, he was going sort of tyrannical within the whole state and sort of lost all of his support. So Dion is actually told that if he returned, he would not even need an army, and people would quickly flock to him and support him. But despite this, he actually generates an army of 800 mercenary soldiers, and the the leader, he actually promises that they could, if he takes Sicily for himself or Syracuse for himself, he promises that the general could become a general there. So obviously a good deal for the mercenary soldiers. Um, so the Philistus, who is one of Dionysius's generals, but also one of his teachers, has a army waiting on the shore. So Dion actually goes straight towards Sicily, avoiding the shore, but he actually goes too far and runs into a storm, which is obviously not good. So they have to retreat to Carthage, where fortunately they're given more supplies. So what looked as though it was a bad turn of events ended up being a windfall. Additionally, on the way, he actually hears that there are 80 ships from Dionysius waiting for him. So he decides he'll walk by land. And on the way, walking towards Syracuse, 5,000 additional soldiers join him. So he was probably sitting around 5,800 soldiers. Probably some of the original 800 mercenaries died, or some of the 5,000 died, but around 5,800 soldiers, which is a lot at this time. And they marched towards Sicily. So they pretty much walk in, and as they're approaching the city, many of the supporters of Dionysius are already killed or being killed off before they get there. But probably the most most geographical importance is that the Acropolis, or the citadel, was on a separate island from the rest of Syracuse. So this is kind of, I think, it could be drawn parallel to in France during the prior to the revolution. Louis XIV, who was called the Sun King, he went through a great period of centralization of government. So what they did was they moved the capital of the palace outside of Paris into Versailles, which was far removed from the city. And I think it has a particularly important political connotation in that if the government is separated from the people, they are both protected and they can sort of rule over them separately. And that's probably why one of the main reasons why Syracuse had a great history of so many tyrants, because they were allowed to reign free here on the island, while the people, no matter how upset, could not really breach them. And this is what happens. So Dion and his about 5,800 soldiers, plus all the other supporters in Sicily who joined him, managed to take over the whole city, but they can't take the Acropolis. So in there, Dionysius is sort of barricaded up, still has the Acropolis, but Dion is pretty much considered to rule Syracuse at this point. He enters the land wearing like brilliant armor and a garland crown, so he's pretty much announcing himself leader of Sicily. He asks for peace, but unfortunately Dionysius does not agree to it because he still has intentions of becoming king. So at this point, Dion and actually his brother as well are actually granted as co-leaders of Syracuse. So this is, I think, maybe a redeeming factor for Dion. So I think the fact that he chose to share the power with his brother at this point is kind of a testament that he wasn't as tyrannical, at least of Dionysius the first or Dionysius the second. He did actually believe in his Platonic teaching. Not to go on too much of a tangent, actually I'll just address it directly here. He starts to get into a lot of problems because the Syracusians find that he is not the democratic leader that they were hoping to get. They were hoping to get something like an Athenian government, and they found that Dion was not the one to bring that, because he actually led the state with a very firm fist. He was very authoritative, and this is actually maybe the most Platonic thing about him, because Plato did not advocate for an absolute democracy. He advocated for something in between. Something, in fact, it might even be more on the authoritative side. It might be a little bit more hard to say left wing or right wing, but he believed in a strong government. Something in Plato's Republic that's quite notable is that, or I found quite interesting, was that he believed in the censorship of even music. Or at least in the words of Socrates, he says that would a state not be better if they were to restrict music to only glorious music and not sad music or anything like that. And obviously the people agreed. So he believes in censorship and a lot of undemocratic things. And as you know, many of the most powerful Western states right now are actually republics, not democracies, because democracies tend to uh, oppose anyone who is ambitious or anyone who tries to produce anything. So too much democracy is obviously bad. So Dion is not entirely wrong here, but he sort of loses the favor and support of the Syracusans. And unfortunately, and I think the most his failing feature is that the general of the mercenary army the 800, his name is Heraclides, who he promised could be a general or powerful individual in Syracuse. He is granted to become leader of the army, but Dion says no, and then he says yes, just because he wanted to give him he wanted he himself to be the one who gave it to him, even though this mercenary general had the right to do so. But either way, he actually has very different policies. He believes in land redistribution, something that Dion did not support, something that was more democratic, something that was more, I would say, left-wing relative to Dion. He also wanted foreign officers to lose their salaries, and he wanted new commanders to be put in place. So this kind of undermines. So Dion, although the leader of the mercenaries sort of started his own sect of government, which was more left-leaning than Dion. Dion was more like the right-leaning party. His mercenaries still supported him, but unfortunately, he is forced to leave the city because this guy Heraclides is getting so powerful and slanders him, and the people support him because they think he's the democratic leader that they'll bring. Not to go on another too long of a tangent, I think one of his problems was that Machiavelli points out in The Prince that to hire mercenary soldiers is obviously good in the short run. It can win them small victories, but they are not really loyal to their leader, not really loyal to the state. And I think this was one of Dion's one of the main reasons why he failed, because he was originally told that he didn't need to hire these 800 soldiers. He already had enough support in Syracuse, but he decided to hire these 800 mercenaries and made them a lot of promises, and they were not very loyal to him. They were just looking for their own self-benefit or their own self-gain. So that was probably one of his biggest failures, and very, I guess, proof to the merit in Machiavelli's beliefs there. So while Dion is gone, so Dion actually leaves Sicily because he's sort of had enough. And even though it's said that perhaps his 800 mercenaries could have still taken over Syracuse because they were very well trained, but he decided he'd leave because he did not want to just start another war. So while he's left, Dionysius was actually still in the citadel. So Heraclides tries to take the citadel. Dionysius actually runs away, and his son, Apollocrates, is actually in the citadel. So things start going sour because Naples sends some troops to also support Apollocrates, or Dionysius' son, but Dion is called in to save them. So, and Dion comes just right in the nick of time, and they manage to take the citadel. Heraclides they saw that he was about to lose the war, so he sort of falls out of favor, but Dion actually pardons him and pardons all his wrongdoings, which, as we'll see, might have been a wrong decision, but once again, a just action on his part, but maybe irrational. So he actually, not only does he pardon Heraclides, he says that Heraclides can be in charge of the navy, while Dion would be in charge of the army. So I think he was just trying to make an ally out of him rather than an enemy out of him, even though Heraclides probably owed Dion so much. But eventually, this individual named Callippus, who was also a student of Plato, was bribed by Dionysius, or actually not even Dionysius, he did it in his own doing. So this individual named Callippus, very, very student of Plato, he sort of, I guess, he sees all these things that are happening, and he sees that probably he can do the same thing. So what he does, and it's very, I would say, Machiavellian. What he does is he hires the he pays some of the soldiers using money he's given by Dionysius. He pays some of the soldiers to plot against Dion. And then what he does is he exposes some of these plotters to Dion. So he betrays some of these individuals. So Dion thinks that Callippus is actually his spy, so his informant. So whenever an individual would accuse Callippus of being evil, he thought that he was actually a spy. But really, Callippus had the intention of becoming a tyrant himself. Eventually, the plot is revealed, and his own wife and his sister both figure it out, and they tell Dion that Callippus has the intent of killing him. But at the very same time, his own son falls from a window and dies, so he is mourning so much that he doesn't take any action. So Callippus hires these assassins called Zacynthians, and these guys wear like light robes, and they carry very few weapons, like small daggers, kind of like the individual in Assassin's Creed, just kind of the stereotypical assassin. So anyway, a group of these individuals hired by Callippus enter his house and close all the shutters, close all the doors, and strangle him and stab him with a dagger. So, and this is because, well, obviously, he was considered a tyrant at this point, but also Callippus saw what opportunity there was in Syracuse for such evil and such power to be attained. So I'll get more to this later. But I guess one other thing was that Dion actually, prior to his death, Heraclides and him sort of had a fallout. Heraclides just kept criticizing him, even though Dion had not only pardoned him, he had also granted him power over the sea. So eventually Dion is convinced to assassinate him. So this also, I think, is important because finally he sort of gives in to the cruelness that was in Syracuse, and finally he does commit murder after so many times letting this guy get off and pardoning him. Finally, when he does it, he sets a precedent for his own assassination. So maybe he was right all along in pardoning Heraclides. So I guess we'll move to Marcus Brutus, and we'll get more to Dion in the comparison. So the most common belief behind Dion's Marcus Brutus's heritage is that he was an ancient descendant of Janius Brutus. So Janius Brutus is famous because he had a statue with a drawn sword in the center of Rome, and he was famous for expelling the Tarquins and destroying the monarchy in ancient Rome and establishing the republic, kind of like the Kingslayer or not even the Kingslayer. He was a Kingslayer. I was going to say it was kind of like in Game of Thrones, but it was different because the monarchy still stayed the same. But he was a symbol of freedom throughout the land, and very great heritage from Marcus Brutus. But Plutarch says that where Janius Brutus, Marcus Brutus's ancient descendant, was inflexible nature like steel, and he was very harsh and unlearned. He was not studious and not softened by philosophy. He even executed his own sons for conspiring with the ancient monarchy of Rome. So he was very, very cruel individual, whereas Marcus Brutus was very much the contrary. He had all the goodness of spirit, but he was softened by philosophy, and he was grace and gentle. And by applying himself to business and public affairs, he had a temper exactly framed for virtue. So Plutarch seems to note that he was even a greater symbol to freedom than Janius Brutus. On his mother's side, also, he was a descendant. His mother was Servilia, who was a descendant of Servilius Ahala, who was one of the individuals who assassinated Spurius Maelius, who was one who tried to start a rebellion in the Roman Republic, who wanted to become king, and Servilius Ahala carried a sword, a dagger under his shoulder, and then assassinated him in a public place. So also very much a symbol of freedom. Other thoughts. Some people criticize Marcus Brutus in that his father was actually, he was not actually a descendant of Janneus, because Janneus obviously killed his two sons, and perhaps Marcus Brutus actually came from plebeian origins. Another belief is that he was actually Caesar's bastard son, and many of these things could be true, but Plutarch sort of likes the idea that he was related to Janneus Brutus because they even had the same name, and some of his descendants looked very similar. And Plutarch sort of ends this section by saying, but of this subject enough, because it really doesn't matter. You can slander these people all you want, but the point was that his goodness of character was enough to justify him being related to Janneus Brutus, and in all intents and purposes, it doesn't really matter. He is what history wants him to be, and I think that is a symbol of freedom, very much like his descendant Janneus Brutus. So, yeah, on his mother's side, Servilia, her brother was actually Cato the Younger. So he very much inspired him and sort of, I think, got him interested in philosophy. Cato the Younger was actually a Stoic, and Marcus Brutus studied all forms of philosophy and was very learned. He was not as great at Latin and Greek as some of his contemporaries, but he was just as learned and just as philosophical as all of them. But he had a particular passion for Platonic philosophy and the academy. He didn't even like the modern day academy. He particularly liked the ancient academy. So he was very much into the classics at the time, even beyond what we'd consider classics today. His own father, interestingly enough, was also was killed by Pompey, who was the head of the Optimates. His father was involved in a conspiracy to overthrow the government, and he was ultimately killed. But it's sort of ironic because Marcus Brutus ultimately ends up supporting Pompey and supporting the Optimates. So I think this is kind of a testament to his good character in his ability to see beyond even his enemies and see into their goodness. So, and we'll see more of that in respect to his relationship with Caesar. So his first political endeavor is working alongside his uncle Cato the Younger in Cyprus. And while there, he obviously learns a lot because being off in the land, there's a lot of opportunities to learn worldliness, especially at a young age. But he proves to above all, he makes a lot of money. He's sort of like a banker. He loans money at very high interest rates, and he ends up, when he does return to Rome, he ends up being very, very rich. And kind of, not to go on too much of a tangent, another individual who made a lot of money through sort of a banking system was Crassus, who was actually the richest man in Rome. But contrary to Marcus Brutus, where Marcus Brutus would give high interest rates, Crassus would actually give no interest rate at all, but he reserved the right to demand the currency at any point. So really taking advantage of the time value of money. So he would recall the debts probably at the best times for him and the worst times for his clients. So, for example, if there was like a downfall in the economy, he would draw his debts and execute his capital. So it's just another way of looking at loaning money. Interest is not it's not as important in all cases as the actual clauses or the ability to reclaim it. And Crassus was the richest man in Rome, so that just could be an interesting point. Just like in today's society, actually, interest rates are so low, but it has given banks so much power because despite the low interest rates, they have so much debt. And if they were to call upon this debt, it's almost more valuable if they have senior clauses in that they have senior rights on claiming the assets. So yeah, just a little bit of a tangent there. But he becomes wealthy, and actually he marries this individual Claudia Pulchra, who's related to Pulcher, who is one of the cruelest Optimates. And this sort of aligns him with the Optimate class. And as noted, this is kind of strange. She starts supporting Pompey, who is an Optimate, who was one of the individuals who caused his father to be killed. So I guess this is just a testament to his great character. He opposed the first triumvirate, and he opposed all of them. But when the civil war eventually breaks up between Pompey and Caesar, he supports Pompey, and Caesar sort of tracks down Pompey and sort of ends up killing him off in Greece in the Battle of Pharsalus. But he demands that Brutus be captured alive, because some say it's because Caesar had been having a relationship with his mother, Servilia, for a long time since they were very young, and Caesar thought that potentially Brutus could have been his own blood, could have been his own son. At one point, actually, during the Catiline conspiracy, where they were deciding whether or not to kill the conspirators or to banish them, it said that Caesar got a note while in the assembly, and it read that Servilia was pregnant. And obviously, the other individuals criticized him a lot for this, but I think it's just a testament to he pretty much stopped speaking and eventually ended up losing his sway in the assembly. But I think he was very, very much in love with Servilia, and for that reason he really transferred a lot of this partiality towards Marcus Brutus, as we'll see. So he not only demands Brutus be captured alive, he actually pardons Marcus Brutus for all of his wrongdoings for supporting Pompey, which is very, very interesting of Caesar. Caesar is actually, despite being known for being the one who established or became dictator for life and being very power hungry, he was actually very, very kind to his opponents and very, very merciful, which is something that all of his other contemporaries didn't have, and that's maybe one of the reasons why he was so much different and so much more successful and unsuccessful relative to them. But either way, Caesar grants him as governor of Gaul, so a very high position, because Gaul was a very important region. It's like modern day France, a very important region for Julius Caesar, because that's where he gained a lot of his political glory, and that's where he sort of came into prominence. So a very powerful area to be given. He is also given the role of urban praetor, which is also a very powerful role within the city itself, the city of Rome itself. He then marries Cato's daughter, Portia, and his mother didn't support this. Sort of a minute fact, but I guess he got his previous divorce to Pulchra. Pulchra was part of the Optimates, so I guess this was an act of him distancing himself with the Optimates class and sort of aligning himself with Julius Caesar. So then, despite this, all the senators eventually convince Marcus Brutus to kill Julius Caesar. And he's sort of opposed to this at first, but he eventually agrees. And this is, I think, once again proves that Marcus Brutus had a sort of ability to put his own experiences or put his own partiality outside of his logic. And he actually agreed, because he saw, despite Caesar being so good to him, giving him many great powerful positions, he saw that Caesar was actually an evil individual and that he needed to be killed. So despite it not being his idea, he kind of became the leader in terms of thought, because he was the most noble of them all. But so on the Ides of March, on the 15th, they went to kill Caesar. So originally Caesar's warned and he didn't show up. So they were all hiding. There was about 60 or so of them, and Marcus Brutus stayed, though, because Julius Caesar was arriving late because he had been warned, but Marcus Brutus decided to wait. If he had not had this patience, Julius Caesar may have never been killed, and who knows where history might have ended at this point. I certainly have no idea. Maybe the Roman Empire could have still been alive today, but either way, he waited, and eventually this individual named Tullius Caesar approaches Julius Caesar and asks him to free his exiled brother, and Julius Caesar is sort of stressed at this moment and sort of scoffs him off, but Tullius Cimber grabs his toga, and Julius Caesar has the famous line, "Why the violence?" And with that, they start stabbing him. And The first to strike, his name was Casca, so I think it's important to note that Marcus Brutus wasn't the first to strike him. I don't even know if Marcus Brutus was one of the individuals who striked him, but the famous quote in William Shakespeare's Julius Caesar is that Julius Caesar says, "Et tu, Brute." Plutarch doesn't note anything like this. He doesn't note that he says anything, but upon Julius Caesar seeing Marcus Brutus, he throws his toga on his head and sort of gives himself. So originally he's sort of fighting himself off, fighting all the killers, all the assassins off. But when he sees Brutus is aligned with them, he sort of gives himself in. So I think that's very telling in that Caesar was very partial and maybe even viewed him as his own son, and I think he did, whether in terms of his respect for him, or if he actually believed they were in blood, or maybe his respect for his mother, Marcus Brutus's mother Servilia. But either way, it was sort of a sad moment for the two. So Marc Antony, actually, who was one of the most powerful people in Rome at this point, because he was sort of potentially heir to Caesar's throne or Caesar's reign, grants all amnesty to all of the assassins. And this is under the condition that they can maintain Caesar's laws, so they are actually spared. So this was actually a very risky thing. Despite there being 60 and many people involved, the liberators were definitely a minority in Rome, and they were at very much great risk of being killed. But Marc Antony actually grants them amnesty. From there, then, though, Octavius is actually granted to be Caesar's heir. Now, I thought about this for a while, so I thought that if Julius Caesar thought Brutus to be his heir, why would Julius Caesar not select Brutus to be his heir? Additionally, why did he not choose Marc Antony, who was actually probably the most qualified to run the estate? Marc Antony, I think we can show off in that he wasn't related to him, and they had a little bit of bitterness in the latter points in their lives. Brutus, he saw, could have been potentially his own son, not obviously legally, but he didn't choose Brutus. Instead, he chose Octavius, who was off in Macedonia, only 19 years old, and was actually only his nephew, so not his direct descendant. So I think maybe, although he might have liked Brutus the most, or might have believed that he was his son, he saw that Octavius had the sort of ambitious gene, and maybe Marcus Brutus was actually too good, in that Marcus Brutus, if he was granted as emperor for life, he would have probably tossed it away and brought back the Republic, like Plato's Republic. And that's not what he wanted to see. He wanted to see he wanted to see Rome become an empire. So instead, Octavius comes into power. And one of the first things Octavius does is he declares all the liberators as enemies of the state, which is obviously no good for them, and they are sort of start to be hunted down. Additionally, there's sort of a fallout between Octavius and Antony, because they both sort of want to control the land, and the two armies start to get weak. So they have Marc Antony and Octavius Caesar, they have a war at the Battle of Mantina, and Cicero informs Marcus Brutus and the other main liberator at the time, Cassius, that the Marc Antony and Octavius armies were both weak, so they should go and attack them now. Now is their opportunity. So they gather up 17 legions and start marching on Rome. Unfortunately for them, though, Octavius and Marc Antony sort of put their differences aside and team up and form 19 legions. So at this point, they sort of outnumbered Cassius and Marcus Brutus. To go into a little bit of background about Cassius, Cassius was very much like Brutus in terms of temperament, but it said, I guess I'll use a quote from Plutarch. He says, all the goodness of the liberators came from Marcus Brutus, and all the baseness came from Cassius. So Cassius was sort of the bad individual. It said that Brutus actually wanted to kill Caesar to establish or to reestablish the Republic, something like Plato's Republic, whereas Cassius was probably in it for his own self-gain. But either way, it was Cassius and Marcus Brutus against Marc Antony and Octavius Caesar. So Brutus and Octavius actually fight, and Marc Antony and Cassius fight. So Antony beats Cassius, but Brutus actually beats Octavius. But after Cassius gets defeated, Cassius actually kills himself. So this leads Octavius and Marc Antony against Marcus Brutus, which is obviously not good odds, considering they even have greater numbers to begin with. So at the second battle, this is the Battle of Philippi, which was basically two major fights. The first one, as I just mentioned, the 2 versus 2. And then the second battle, they are defeated, and Marcus Brutus flees with 14 legions. With that, he actually kills himself. He has some of his men hold out a sword, and he runs into the sword. And he has this quote when he dies: By all the means must we fly, not with our feet, however, but with our hands. So I'm not too sure about the interpretation here, but the one that I like most, or the one that I came up with, was it has really nothing to do with the actual particular killing of himself, but is more philosophical in that individuals must do whatever they can to accomplish what they must, but they must do it the hard way, because by all means we must fly. So if you have to do something, do whatever you can to do it. But then it continues, not with our feet, however, but with our hands. So I figure with this, hands are obviously much more difficult to use than with your feet. So it's kind of like, claw at those inches, to use the Al Pacino quote. So really push hard to get what you want done. Or it could have been something more direct. He just means kill himself with his hands rather than with his feet, but that would make sense because he ran into the sword. So I'm not too sure, but I think it's an interesting quote, and I'll continue to think about this. Another famous quote throughout his life is "Sic semper tyrannis," thus ever be tyrants. So he sort of hypothesized that there will always be tyrants. And to draw a parallel, this is actually what John Wilkes Booth said when he assassinated Abraham Lincoln. He sort of saw Abraham Lincoln as a tyrant. And interestingly enough, John Wilkes Booth's father's name was Janius Brutus Booth. So I think John Wilkes Booth, who was actually a famous actor at the time, thought he was sort of like a Marcus Brutus, and he wanted to destroy Abraham Lincoln for that very reason. Interestingly enough, he was also an actor, so he actually played the part of Marc Antony in a Julius Caesar play, while his brother played a Marcus Brutus. So he was very much familiar with this story, and I think he sort of empathized or thought he was a modern day Marcus Brutus. But I still don't think you can congratulate him in the way you can Marcus Brutus, because I don't think Abraham Lincoln was in any ways a tyrant. I think he was a very good man, and I think John Wilkes Booth was very much irrational in this belief. I guess I'll finish off with this quote, and then I'll go into the comparison. This was the noblest Roman of them all. All the conspirators, save only he, did that they did envy of that they did in envy of great Caesar. He only, in general honest though, and common good to all, made one of them. His life was gentle, and the elements so mixed in him that nature might stand up and say to the world, "This was a man." So this was a quote by Marc Antony in Shakespeare's Julius Caesar. So to kind of break it down, this is coming from Marc Antony. Marc Antony obviously probably didn't say this, but he might have been partial, because he actually grants Marcus Brutus a good burial, and he is actually posthumously respected. But I think this is reflective of Shakespeare's belief. So Marcus Brutus was the noblest of them all is pretty obvious, but all the conspirators, save only he, did that they did in envy of great Caesar. So that's kind of like in reference to Cassius. So Cassius did what they did because they envied Caesar. He only, in general honest though, and common good to all, made one of them. So he joined them, he joined in their cause. This is a Comicini painting of the death of Caesar, the assassination of Caesar. So he joined in because he wanted the common good to all, while all the other conspirators did it because they envied Caesar or wanted their own achievement, or they wanted their own power. His life was gentle, as noted, and the elements so mixed in him that nature might stand up and say to the world, this was a man. So I think of all the characters in William Shakespeare's Julius Caesar, his favorite was Marcus Brutus. And obviously Shakespeare, whether Shakespeare was one guy or was a company of individuals, they obviously did their research and believed that he was the most to be respected of them all. So yeah, moving to the comparison. So I usually start with the differences, so that's what I'll do. So it said that Dion, or Plutarch says that Dion did what he did largely alone, while Marcus Brutus had the help of Cassius and of the other liberators. So this is, I think, a fair argument. But to move forward, it said also that Dion spent money through his endeavors, whereas Marcus Brutus made money. So whilst Marcus Brutus was engaging on politics or anything, he was always making money, he was always loaning money. But I don't think he obviously wasn't that corrupt. Like Crassus obviously got his money in corrupt ways. Simply loaning money is not inherently evil. Maybe he actually wanted to finance projects and actually wanted to create value. And additionally, in contrast to that, I think Dion's money was not really rightfully earned. It was money from Dionysius the First, who was a tyrant. So it was money that was stolen from the people that he was giving away. So it wasn't really that commendable. But either way, when Dion was banished, it was actually, he got sort of a nice period where he could kind of relax in ancient Athens and sort of enjoy some plays and enjoy some rituals. Whereas when Marcus Brutus was declared an enemy of the state, he was sort of running, and obviously not as enjoyable of a banishment or a fall from power. It said that for Dion, when fighting Dionysius was truly cruel, and even after Dionysius was eventually removed, they supported what he did. Whereas Marcus Brutus, it's debatable whether Caesar was truly evil. I think Caesar, obviously, he was very power hungry, but he did want what was best for the state. So after Caesar's dead, many individuals regretted it and wished Caesar to be brought back, and for that reason they were declared enemies of the state. So in terms of Caesar might have been a more difficult enemy to oppose, he might have not been an enemy at all. He might have actually just been misunderstood. So it was not entirely right for what Brutus did, but I think Brutus thought it through, and he made the right decision. Obviously, it was more risky in killing Caesar. They had a lot of popular. There was just 60 of them against pretty much all of Rome. They could have been killed at any moment. Whereas when Dion entered into Syracuse, he had the support of all the people, and they were pretty much cheering him on as he went to go and kill or oppose Dionysius and his son. So it was sort of easier in that regards as well. And it said that Dion, and probably his fatal flaw, was that he trusted ill men. He laid a lot of his trust in mercenaries, and they ultimately ended up betraying him and ended up serving their own purposes. Whereas Marcus Brutus actually made good allies of himself. And Cassius, although he was much more harsh and much more evil, he was trustworthy. And even while he was an ally of Caesar, he was actually the one who betrayed Caesar, not vice versa. So he saw that Caesar could be trusted. So I guess with that regards, Brutus was better at choosing his allies than Dion. And obviously, going to similarities, I think they're quite obvious at this point. They were both very much into Platonic teachings. They believed in sort of a Plato's Republic, and that's what they both sort of fought to establish. and they are both symbols of freedom, both in Syracuse or Greece and Rome, respectively. So yeah, that's the end of this video. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you watch the next ones and those that are preceding. Thanks so much. Bye.